Ian, welcome and thank you for being here with us.
No problem. Thank you for having me, so to speak.
What have been the key focus areas for SuperChoice in the last 2 years?
We've been responding to industry regulatory change. So that's been the main driver of what we've been doing, but it's led a substantial transformation within the organisation. And what I mean by that is we've redeveloped our core platform to respond to the industry requirements. We've changed the way we develop that platform. We've tried to change the culture to be a lot more orientated towards software as a service type of service delivery. And then more recently, we've really fundamentally tried to reshape our infrastructure so as to not only enable us, but to support us moving forward.
What would you say are the factors that led you to adopt a multi-cloud strategy?
We were lucky in that we came at this a little bit later than perhaps other people, and I think we were able to benefit from that experience. And one of the things that it highlighted was that when you look at cloud service providers, what you're largely looking at is a scale industry. Now, we don't have scale, so that was one of the key reasons for why we looked at going down the cloud path. But when you start to do that, you realise there's a fundamental driver of economics in that infrastructure is largely a fixed cost, and so therefore the opportunity to arbitrage between different providers and to essentially take advantage of spot or marginal pricing should give us some real benefits and opportunities. We've done some research, we did some preliminary research with AWS where we looked at spot versus fixed pricing. And depending on your ability to take advantage of that, the savings were substantial. On average, for 11 different configurations we looked at, it was an average of 84%. So that's huge. And I think the other thing that you start to look at is it's not just about price. I think that's where perhaps a lot of people start. But for us, it was really the substantial change that it drives in the way we develop our code. So to have developers who are in a position to, at demand virtually, create new environments to test and then to deploy, for us to be able to shift from being, like it would take us 10 plus weeks to create a whole new environment that was ready for a client to use, we can now do that in a little under an hour. That's a substantial change in sort of the way you think about it and the way you provide services.
How would you say that adopting the RightScale Cloud Management Platform has improved governance and cost optimization of your IT infrastructure?
Well, I think the advantage of RightScale is more about the advantage of automating the whole deployment process. When you stop thinking of infrastructure as hardware and start thinking of it as software, a whole bunch of things become available to you that weren't really traditionally available. All the software quality techniques that developers would be familiar with, you can now apply to infrastructure because you can treat it as software. When you start to shift to software as well, you have a repeatable process. So we estimate that somewhere between 60 to 70% of our deployment issues are driven purely by configuration drift. And there's probably a number of different formats of that drift, but largely for little discrepancies that creep in between environments.
Wow.
The ability to automate through RightScale means that virtually disappears overnight. And that's certainly, to date, we've been focusing on pre-production environments, and that's certainly been the case in those areas, and we'll expect that to carry across to production when we move there.
Yeah.
The other advantage of RightScale that we get is, obviously when you're looking at a multi-cloud provider environment, you need some sort of consistent way about which to manage that environment. And so RightScale gives us a consistent pane of glass, if you like, into each of those environments that allows us to manage it in a much more seamless and efficient way.
If I turn to Office now, what are your thoughts on Office's professional services capability?
Obviously as a happy customer, we've been really pleased with the service, but I think what led us to Office originally is probably the most interesting thing for you. And it was really that expertise in the area of automated deployments and RightScale. I mean, there aren't just that many people in the market who are familiar with this. Consistently, the research that we've had is that this is an area that people are trying to get into, trying to develop expertise, but the reality is, and we've talked to other people that use RightScale, there aren't that many people out there that really understand it. So for us, it was the combination of the individuals, and there's been certainly some exceptional guys from that have worked with us from Office, and then the access into RightScale.
Do you see a future when the entire corporate enterprise architecture is in the cloud and is the norm? And if so, when?
Absolutely. I think it's just a question of timing. I used to work for a large bank, and that large bank, even given its scale and size, didn't think that it had sufficient scale to be able to manage infrastructure. And so I think it's only inevitable that over time, that's what people will migrate to. You know, everyone's probably seen the video clips and the stories of how people used to generate their own electricity on site. And, you know, today that's something that no one would really seriously consider. I think IT's a little bit different. The analogy still holds in direction, but I think IT's a little bit different in it's a little bit more complicated. There's still a lot of issues that people have around security and confidence and reliability, and you know, the outage with AWS on the weekend highlights some of those concerns. They're legitimate concerns, but all IT is about making trade-offs. And when you're a small firm that doesn't have the economies of scale, then you need to make those trade-offs. I think it'll probably start with the smaller firms, and then it'll migrate to larger ones.
How has SuperChoice improved its capacity to better service its customers?
So, well, I can give you a couple of examples of that. One example would be we run a multi-tenanted environment. Now, that has some advantages, but a disadvantage from a client's point of view is that when we deploy code to UAT environment for them to test, everyone has to test it at the same time, and it gets deployed to production at the same time. That creates difficulties, particularly for large financial service institutions that aren't geared up for those sorts of timeframes. So recently we had a client come to us who wanted us to create a dedicated test environment for them. Normally that would take 8 to 10 weeks to do. We were able, and they wanted multiple clients, multiple test environments. We took probably about the same time to produce the first one. But interestingly, when we produced the second environment, that took about 4 hours.
Right.
And then now we've produced a third one for them. So with the automation, whilst the effort up front is not dissimilar from the physical deployment, the benefits are really then what you get down the track. So we would never be able to spin up another environment in something like 4 hours for a client historically. And that's a huge benefit. And we've even had really positive feedback from the client, because the other advantages it gives you is you can play with the performance settings around the system so much easier this way. And so, you know, they've actually given us very positive feedback about the performance of the environment, which is what led to the third one.
So with DevOps and with environment provisioning automation, how and to what extent do you see the IT asset value changing?
I think obviously the value in terms of what IT can deliver to the business is it makes you far more responsive. You know, we all hear about the internet startups that are deploying sort of continuously throughout the day, but for many of us that's sort of an aspirational goal, if it is a goal at all. Certainly what we've found is the nature, the linkage between the developer and when they've produced their code and when that's deployed into production, that is much more immediate and that's much faster. Now there's a trade-off here, which, you know, we've found as we've gone through this. If you have any problems in the way that you build and deploy code, this just highlights them, magnifies them in fact. But for us that's been a value, because we'd rather find out about those problems now through this process than through a production outage.
Of course, and you know straight away if there is a problem as soon as you deploy.
Yeah. Now, I think the other flip side of this is, like, you know, we keep talking about speed to market or those sorts of the connotations of getting things out there quickly. The part of the interesting experience that we've had is the impact that has on developers. The developers are actually now, whilst they have more power and more flexibility, they're also conscious of that responsibility.
Yes.
And so they're actually much more nervous about the power that they can provide. Equally, our security guys are also much more nervous because, you know, whereas a vulnerability vector might be an individual server, now the vulnerability vector is the automation deployment software, because if I can hack that, then every time I automate my deployment, I've effectively hacked that process as well.
Right.
So the nature of the risks, I would argue, change. I don't think they go away or they get any bigger. They've just changed. And you know, it's managing more those soft areas in terms of roles and responsibilities, the change in the skill sets that you need, the change in the responsibilities that you have. They're probably been some of the bigger changes that we've had to deal with.
And how have your teams responded to this shift of responsibilities?
Mixed, to be open. I think some of the guys have really taken it on board and seen it as a huge opportunity. Other people have felt a bit threatened in terms of what does it do for their traditional skills. And in many cases, people who've built up experience here and so derive a sense of importance out of their knowledge and those skills can feel threatened. But one of the things we've tried to do consistently is communicate with the guys about what's happening, but also to make sure that they feel supported in terms of being given the training, being given the time to make the adjustments.
What do you see are the key challenges for corporates following a multi-cloud strategy?
I think we've been a little bit lucky in that the industry change drove us to redevelop our core platform, and so we've been able to piggyback off that process. I think the challenge for large corporates is they're not going to have that luxury. They're going to have a legacy environment that they really need to work through. Now, I think one of the interesting things that we did, and it was driven by the necessity of the dedicated test environment for our client, was many people start by deploying their newest apps as being the most cloud ready, whereas we actually did the opposite. We took our core legacy system that was built, probably started to get built 17 years ago, and we've deployed that to the cloud. Like, we've had that running in AWS, we've had that running in a private cloud facility. We can move it between the two. Unusual way of going about it, but if there's anything, if I was a large corporate organisation, if anything I draw out of that is you can actually go through this process with legacy app and still get value out of it and still have the same sort of process that you'd have as if it was a new sort of more cloud ready application.
If you can do it with that, you can do it with anything, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I was talking to our guys about it the other day, and they sort of said, like, that's not the way you do it necessarily, but there is a line of thought that often says, if you're trying something out, go with the hardest thing, because that's going to identify all the issues. And certainly that's part of the value that we got out of that exercise. It surfaced for the project team all the key issues, but the other thing was when we actually went back to the organisation and we said, hey guys, do you realise we've just deployed our legacy app into AWS, it's working, and we can have that up and running in just under an hour. The amazement on the look on some of the faces was just priceless, including, you know, our CEO, who sort of said, are you serious? We've actually done that. So I think that did a lot to boost people's confidence about the direction we were taking and the fact that it can work.
And now you've got great flexibility, because not only will it work in AWS, but you can then port that to any major cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we raised earlier the issue on the weekend with AWS. But equally, it wasn't that long ago when Azure announced over a weekend they were changing their prices by 27%. Right. So, the advantage for us is we have the ability, the flexibility to move around as price or capability requires.
Yes, and you can keep getting best of breed from any cloud, no matter how the cloud landscape changes over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, Ian, really appreciate your time today. Great interview, and thanks so much for your time.
No, I was happy to be here.
Thank you.